So we're back once again to this chart, and I realized that in the last year I really set it out of order, but it wasn't bad. This is immaterial that needs to be learned over and over and over again if you're going to penetrate more deeply into the really deepest levels of Kabbalah. The basic lessons of this chart are, we'll look at this chart, and if you look up at the top, right, so just going over it, you see that there's a name. Well, here it is right here, YAAKOV. This is where the chart starts. And then different combinations of that name. There's 12 of them. Go around the chart. So in this little place, before we get into our lecture, exactly where we're at, let's read what what Rabbi YAAKOV KRONENBERG said about this chart. This is the chart called the birth chart of Adam HaRishon, of the first man, where human beings first became, well, first human. The basic lesson of Adam's charts comes to teach us that you should think that all the energies, or you should not think that all of the energies are coming from the planets or the signs only. So that when people ask you, like, what's your sign? So he said, when people ask you something like that, you think that that's the whole powerful thing. But he wants to say, as if they're the ones who determine what is happening down here on Earth, as if, say, for example, the sun was in Taurus when I was born. So what does Taurus have to do with me? So it may have something to do, but he wants to say that it's not the Taurus itself, but it's the light that's coming behind the Taurus that filters through that constellation. They are the conduits of much higher influences. Everything really comes from God, and it comes, among other things, through the permutations of his names. So through these different permutations, which are 12 of God's name, the energies coming down are different. They're going to be different in each month because the combination of the lights are going to be refracted through different letter combinations. So let's go over here and let's see what I did here. So now we're in this spot. Let me see if I can bring it. Well, we can still work with it. So he writes like this. We have been discussing, and in the last year we discussed a great deal of what's going on in the Sefer Yetzirah. And he said, we've discussed the 5 levels in the zodiac, and that was the picture that we just saw, that there were 5. And we know that in Western astrology, there are only 2 levels. We see the houses, and we know that there are 12 houses in each person's chart, and each house is about a different area of life. And the first house is the ascendant. It is the house of the person himself, or herself, their appearance, their nature, their characteristics, their looks, etc. The second house is the person's wealth. The third house is the siblings. The fourth house is the family. The fifth house is the children. The sixth house is servant and servitude. The seventh house is the partner in life. In other words, the seventh house is marriage. The eighth house is death. The ninth house is religion. The 10th house is the person's career. And the 11th house is the person's friends. And the 12th house is the person's enemies. And all this was the first level. And the second level is that of the 12 constellations, which are in the zodiac, which are the 12 constellations, which are Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, Leo, Virgo, Libra, Scorpio, Sagittarius, Capricorn, Aquarius, and Pisces. And each of these constellations is connected to different houses in the chart, and each one is ruled by a different planet. But the planets are not discussed here because they are so much connected to the signs of the zodiac. But in any case, you already see 2 things which are based on the number 12. So the number 12 is really a very important number. And that's what we've been discussing over here in this piece. Excuse me for losing the place. Okay, we're okay so far? A very important number, he says. And this whole series of lessons has been constructed around one thing, that is the number 12, which we shall come back to. And we also came to study the idea according to which there are also based on what is called the 12 simple pshutos, the simple letters that exist in the Hebrew alphabet, And we shall come back to that too. So refer to, once again, to the previous lecture. So in any case, the level of the constellations in the zodiac was the second level. And refer back to the chart which we showed originally. I used to have one that was loose, but I don't see it right now. And these two levels are the levels which the non-Jewish astrologers focus on. And that is where their system basically ends. They have the houses, the planets, and constellations, and the stars, but there is basically no more than that in non-Jewish astrology. The Western astrological system, and basically the non-Jewish astrological system, goes as far as that. That also includes the system of Eastern astrology. So in this series of lectures, I didn't really discuss these two levels, but I talk about these two levels in other places. Now, let me just adjust this camera a little bit, so it'll make it easier on me not to lose the place. I give us a series of lessons, Rabbi YAAKOV says, which are shorter, and in fact, they're about 10-minute lessons. Each lesson is a 10-minute one. There, we'll talk about standard astrology. Those lessons are based on the Jewish tradition, of course, and indeed, according to the Jewish tradition, we hold that every kind of astrology, which is known today, had been passed down from Adam HaRishon. So this is not a new concept. When Adam HaRishon became conscious in our world, he was aware of his connection to the cosmos and the cause of all things. Who was the main man in history? So that's the man of history. Who passed in it on. He took this knowledge of how the constellations are moving and the Kabbalah of that, passed it on to other select people who passed it on to yet another people and so forth. And there was the time of the dispersion, when it had been cast out to all the different parts of the world. And that explains how the knowledge of astrology goes to all the civilized lands. And there are no arguments about them on the particulars of astrology. For example, as to the question of how they close all the different constellations, this can be the only logical explanation. I'm not sure about what that sentence was. Let me read it again. For example, and as to the question of how they chose all the different constellations, so how, in fact, if you have a sky full of stars, how do you know where the combinations of the stars are? This can be only a logical explanation that it was actually handed down from the first man who knew the forces of nature. Because there is no logical reason to draw the pictures of the constellations the way they were drawn. And it's not logical to say that each country, from one country to another, without any changes, let me see if I got each country, came to this logic independently. And it's also difficult to prove that somehow it passed from one country to another without any changes being made to it. Because if it passed from one country to another without any changes being made to it, then the question arises, how come everybody accepted it without arguing or making any changes in anything regard to it? You have different cultures, different worldviews, everything is different. This is far-fetched too, because you all know that the game in America, where the where one whispers something to another, and he or she is supposed to whisper that same thing to a third person, and so on. And at the end, there is no connection between the words. The last persons whispered to one another, and what the first person whispered to the second, so it is very hard to expect things to be passed properly from one civilization to another, without seeing any changes made. And indeed, the Jewish astrology holds that the principles of astrology were passed down from Adam HaRishon, from the first man to the next generation, and from that generation the awareness and the knowledge of this was passed down to the following generation, and then from teacher to student. The fact is the matter, you know, that I'm thinking that the Big Bang Theory, which postulates that there was a starting point to the universe, the physical universe, and that it is expanding from there. But that's the nature of everything. First there was one man, then there were 3, then there were 5, then there were 12, 15. They multiplied. And the multiplication, though, is basically the same man multiplying himself many, many different times in many, many different places, but the tradition remains the same. It's all expanding. Because if you don't believe and hold that it had been passed down this way, then it would not be logical for the Jews, For Jews don't believe in things which are invented by a man in a cave, so for example, who just decided that this is the way it should be, and that night, and then he told his friends, and they all just decided to make constellations and stuff of that kind. That's not what's going on. That's not the Jewish way. Because we have a tradition, we hold and believe in that tradition, that things that were traditionally handed over to us, and anything else is not really for us. So, in any case, that's how I see it. So, they give you a little bit, I'm trying to make some room here for myself, a big book, and I got a lot of things on my desk. So he said, but in any case, in terms of the first 2 levels, there are many similarities between the Western astrology and the Jewish tradition, because it all really came from the same source. But of course, there will be differences in it too, because between Western astrology and Jewish astrology, and we shall talk about these differences over time. And if, in fact, all these lessons are in a way talking about these differences, and for example, I talk about the higher 3 levels in the horoscope, which nobody among the other nations talk about at all. They don't have a YAAKOV. Maybe the reason for that is due to the amount of secret wisdom which is connected to these 3 higher levels in the horoscope. Or maybe the reason is because these 3 levels are connected to the Hebrew alphabet, which we had mentioned previously, because as we see, the permutations of God's name are all based on Hebrew letters. And this may be the hidden wisdom, because the knowledge of those 3 levels in the horoscope is all based on the Hebrew alphabet. In other words, let me give you an example. In the Zohar, where it talks about the time of the dispersion just after Noah, when all the people of the world gathered in one place, as you see if you read the Bible there, and they built the Tower of Babel, and a city, it is said a city and a tower. Let me get this lined up, right? And they wanted to gain control over the spiritual forces, and the whole world gathered there. And as it is said, and at that time, let's just say that we don't know the size of the world, but it was close enough that all of humanity gathered there. It is said that they spoke one language, and they said simple things. It is explained in the Zohar that the language they spoke was Hebrew. At that time, the whole world spoke Hebrew. And this is another interesting phenomenon, a thing, because really the anthropologists and linguistics came to that idea too, which is that all languages come from one primary language, but they are just not sure as to what was the language which all the other languages developed from. So we say, and our wisdom dates back way, way before them, that it's Hebrew. They're still working on it, but we hope that they will come to the right conclusion at a certain time. But in any case, there is a book from the 12th century, which was written by the famous Rabbi Avraham Abulafia. This person was a Kabbalist, and he showed that in that book how the Greek and Latin languages came from Hebrew, that you can actually see how, especially I have a chart, I used to have it, of how the different languages are related. The letters of the languages are different constructs of Hebrew letters. So there is some concrete proof for that. So in any case, where the Torah talks about the dispersion of the Zohar, dispersion, that is the Jews spread, but everything spread, the Zohar asks a question, because if you read about the dispersion, you see that the reason for all of the people trying to rebel against God at that time and being so successful was the fact that they knew the language of the angels and spiritual levels in the higher world, which is Hebrew. Because indeed the whole world, or almost the whole world, gathered at one place, and they all spoke one language and were very, very powerful. And there was a danger of them taking control over the spiritual forces. They knew of the spiritual forces in a way that, especially living in the Western world, is very, very suppressed. And then what did God do? He came down and confused all their languages, And he also sent all those people to different areas in the world. So instead of all of them being together, he dispersed them all over the world. And then instead of one language, they had, up to then, they had many languages from that time on. So it became hard for people from one place, from different countries, to communicate with one another. So the Zohar asked this question: why did God have to do both things? Wasn't it enough just to disperse the people? If some are going to be in Honolulu, Hawaii, and others are going to be in Africa, and they can never get together again and build a tower and try to gain control over spiritual powers, like we see now. There are billions of people and scattered all over everywhere. And he says, and the answer to that is that indeed, it wasn't enough to disperse them because there was something special in the Hebrew language. The Hebrew language was the only language that the angels knew. Angels are emissaries. They are channels of communications between the world, the physical world in which we live, and the world which is beyond, which is purely non-physical, and which the spiritual beings in the upper worlds understood. So when all people were together at that time, they all spoke Hebrew. And because they knew the Hebrew language, they were so successful in building the tower and everything because they were able to force the angels to take oaths. Now, this is a whole concept, and how you do this, I don't know, according to which they pledged to do their will. In other words, they can manipulate the physical reality. The angels who are the conduits of the force of reality, were able to manipulate the reality. They were able to get a hold of them. Now, how that works, I don't know. The angels were made to the angels were made by a little misprint to bow. There should be bow to do their will, and to do that, they were able to build the city and the tower. That's exactly how they did that. They were able to use spiritual forces to build try to fight the spiritual forces. So you see that it wasn't enough to disperse them, because they could still use the holy name. So if you could use the holy names, so God had to confuse their languages too. And once he did that, then they couldn't get up to their higher levels anymore, and they couldn't ask other people because they were dispersed. So they couldn't gather together. So in any case, and due to the dispersion of their languages being confused, they couldn't influence the angels and the higher powers anymore because they didn't have the knowledge of the Hebrew language anymore. And that was the only language which the angels know. Now, we'll stop here. We'll try to go on a little bit further in another shiur. This is Baruch Fleischman. You're listening to the tremendous, really, work. It's just tremendously deep. It's not a common, what would you say, that's a common man's limud. This is very, very, very deep stuff, and we'll see how it goes. It seems plain to me, this last part he said. This is Baruch Fleischman.